After the devastation of World War I, the German people were crying out for a savior, someone to drag the country out of its depression and build Germany up to the colossal country it once was. Adolf Hitler thought himself right for the job and would secure his position as a dictator by any means necessary.
He really saw himself as a man of destiny who was going to lead Germany out of all of that misery.
Adolf Hitler's regime of terror and destruction inflicted brutal horrors throughout the Third Reich. Ideas of making Germany great again and establishing a pure race indoctrinated the German people to support him indefinitely.
When he started, he was really very popular, certainly within the first few years in which he was in power, and it seemed like the economy was going well. You know, the majority of people in Germany, I think it's fair to say, really liked Hitler, and they thought that actually he is transforming our nation.
But how did a man with such deranged and atrocious views go on to establish an empire of evil? Austria, 1889. Born into a devout Roman Catholic family, Adolf Hitler had a troubled childhood. An intelligent boy with no interest in school, Hitler is a disappointment to his father, who becomes increasingly violent.
Hitler's father, Alois, was quite a tyrannical father figure, very patriarchal, very strict and very authoritarian, both as a father and as a husband to his wife, his younger wife, Clara.
His father was a minor official. He was a very bullying, domineering figure who used to regularly beat Hitler. He was quite elderly, he was very distant. Frankly, he wasn't a nice man. And of course, you know, children with bullying parents end up very psychologically damaged. This is in no way to forgive Hitler, but it partly explains why he became the man he became.
From his high school years in Linz, a young impressionable Adolf becomes inspired by his history teacher, a man infatuated with the idea of German nationalism. This gives Hitler a newfound purpose and a set of principles he will maintain throughout his life.
Hitler was not an unintelligent boy, but he was not interested in his studies, and so he didn't do very well at school, leaving with not particularly good grades or qualifications.
With dreams of becoming an artist, he moves to Vienna in 1907 with the hopes of attending the prestigious Vienna Academy of Art. But his application is rejected both times he applies.
In 1907, when he's 18, Hitler decides to seek his fortune and fame as an artist when he moves to Vienna. And he's desperate to get into the art school. And there he's going to learn and study how to become the great painter that he so desperately wants to be. And I suppose, you know, retrospect is a fine thing. And if only that tutor had let him into the art school and not turned him down, perhaps all the misery that Hitler inflicted upon the world might never have happened.
With crushed dreams sending him into a deep depression, Hitler finds himself selling hand-drawn postcards to make money whilst living in a hostel, unemployed, an experience that will encourage his brutality.
He lived quite a miserable existence in Vienna in the men's hostel and really just tried to make money by selling postcards of the art that he produced, just as a way of making a little bit of money, but certainly this wasn't the art career that he had intended or hoped for.
He felt this intense sense of failure, this huge ego which thought, you know, he was the brilliant artist, doesn't get into the art school. And so what he does is he spends his time in Vienna over quite a few years, drifting. You know, he's like a kind of dosser.
During this period of poverty, Hitler engages in a lot of political activity, attending meetings and absorbing local news and literature. He was especially intrigued by one specific tactic used: violence. Living in Vienna also provokes a developing hatred for Jews. Vienna in 1910 has a large Jewish population, with over 105,000 Jews living in the city center.
He's exposed to very ugly strains of nationalism and racism and anti-Semitism. And like a lot of kind of poor, benighted individuals. He has to look for someone to blame outside himself. And at the time, at that time, in the middle of Europe, at the turn of the century, the bogeymen for so many people were the Jews. It was totally unjustified, of course, but Hitler would look at the Jewish people and think that in many ways they might be responsible for his own failures. Grossly unfair, of course.
At the youthful age of 21, Hitler's main policies for Nazism are already coming together. Intense rage, supporting violent acts, extreme nationalism, and the loathing of Jews. When war breaks out in 1914, after moving to Munich the previous year, Adolf Hitler volunteers for service in the German army, believing Germany can win the war and prove its power within Europe. His role as a messenger is required to take important information to the front line.
Now, it's tempting to think that Hitler would have been a complete failure as a soldier, but actually he turns out to have been really quite successful in some ways. He was a runner, which is a very brave job because you're running between trenches and you can be hit by a shell or a sniper at any time. It's a really, really courageous job. And actually he deservedly wins the Iron Cross Second Class, which is a really, really good honor.
However, during the Battle of Ypres, in a British gas attack, Hitler is injured and loses his sight temporarily. When his eyesight doesn't return after a few days, doctors are confused and turn to a leading German psychologist who infers that his blindness is not physical, but hysterical.
When he recovered from being gassed and when he gets his sight back, he feels he's sort of stepped into a new part of his life. He's come out of the darkness, come out literally out the dark blindness, and then suddenly his eyes are opened, and there's this sort of moment in which Hitler now thinks that maybe he's ready to start anew in some way. So this is a crucial part.
At the end of World War I, a delusional Hitler hears the news that Germany has surrendered and finds a new hatred within him. He believes he can be the one to liberate Germany and carry the country to success. Hitler returns to a Munich that is suffering post-war. He believes Germany only surrendered because of the betrayal by left-wing Jewish politicians, which only fuels his hatred for the religion.
When Germany finally capitulates, Hitler is like millions of other servicemen, and indeed civilians, who regards the German army as being what's called stabbed in the back. And this becomes this huge myth that basically it's the people in Berlin who are responsible for the defeat and not really the Allies. And the people in Berlin are members of the left. They are Jews. They are all these sort of kind of quote-unquote evil people that Hitler and his fellow soldiers regard as having betrayed the likes of him.
This idea that the German army would have been victorious on the battlefield and that this peace treaty was signed in a way that wasn't to Germany's benefit. And of course, that peace treaty was very punitive. So many articles in it making restrictions on many things, on the size of the German army, which had to be limited to 100,000, to the standing army, took away land that was German. It banned any union between Austria and Germany, and of course Hitler had a lot to say about that, among many, many other harsh provisions.
Fueled with anger and contained rage, Hitler discovers the German Workers' Party, the underdog party with only a few hundred supporters. He is engulfed in their extreme political views and wants to be involved in their manifesto.
After the war, Hitler's actually working for a small army intelligence unit, and he's actually tasked with spying on extremist small political parties in Munich. So one day, Hitler, kind of incognito, goes along to this small party meeting. And it's the German Socialist Workers' Party. And he's meant to be spying on them, but actually he looks at their message and what they're saying about the way the world is and how Germany should be, and how they've been stabbed in the back by their masters in Berlin, and how the communism is on the rise, and how the Allies have utterly brought Germany to her knees with the Versailles Treaty, with those huge reparations. And Hitler looks at the message being being promulgated by this party and goes, you know what, I want a part of that.
Hitler joined the DAP, the German Workers' Party, in 1919, and it was a very small and unremarkable party on the radical right of German politics, and actually one of dozens of similar parties, and quite unremarkable, until Hitler joined and really made a difference.
The party soon notices Hitler's passion when speaking and ranting about his views, and appoint him as their chief of propaganda. He shortly renames the party to the National Socialism German Workers' Party, what we now know as the Nazi Party.
Hitler's initial job for the Nazi Party is really in charge of their propaganda, and that job will later be done famously by Joseph Goebbels. But Hitler is very much aware, and this is where he's very advanced and very sophisticated for his time, that actually what's key is how you get your message out there.
So some of the important ways in which he helped the party to develop was through the initiation of a newspaper, so a party newspaper called the Volkische Beobachter, the People's Observer.
And also what Hitler is absolutely amazing at is speech making. And to begin to understand Hitler, you've really got to understand that he was the most amazing demagogue. He got on that stage, this little man, and he would sort of grow in stature. He would sort of absolutely take over the entire beer hall with his presence. And he would shout and he'd get quiet and he would almost enter into a kind of trance. And the audiences would be mesmerized by this. And indeed, they'd be mesmerized by it for decades. And this is key to how Hitler gets into power, because when he's on the stage, he becomes another figure.
Dieses Land seine neue Mission. Sie entspricht dem Gebot, das einst die deutschen Siedler aus allen Gauen des Altreichs hierher gerufen hat. Die älteste Ostmark des deutschen Volkes soll von jetzt ab das jüngste Bollwerk der deutschen Nation und damit des Deutschen Reiches sein.
Really, what Hitler was doing with the Nazi Party at this time was signaling its arrival and its advent into a serious political contender. And then it started to move away and make a place for itself in German politics.
Hitler's aim is to gain power by force, not election, and quickly enlists one of his new favorite techniques: violence. He forms a military organization made up of discontented ex-soldiers who display strong patriotism, much like himself. The SA, who become known as the Stormtroopers or Brown Shirts, they were prepared to commit violent acts of force and terror to scare people into supporting their party, no matter the cost of their actions.
Hitler initially is very revolutionary minded. He's looked at how Mussolini has taken power in fascist Italy by his famous march on Rome. And Hitler's thinking, actually, well, this is what I need to do. I need to do a sort of a march, I'm not going to wait to get to power, in a kind of democratic process. I mean, that's just going to take me forever. You know what, I'm going to seize power. Let's not, waste our time, with the ballot box. Let's use force.
On the 8th of November, 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into a beer hall where the state prime minister is holding a meeting and attempt to seize power, with Hitler firing a single gunshot into the ceiling, declaring a national revolution. They then march into Munich, declaring that they will seize power. But the state police have been alerted, and they open fire.
They were very quickly fired upon by the police forces, and the event was a fiasco in the end. I think that maybe the most important thing that came out of this subsequently was that Hitler realized that he would have to find a way to take his power in Germany in a legal way, rather than by force.
This is an absolute farce. Any account of the beer hall putsch that says it was a heroic and noble effort by the Nazis to seize power, I'm afraid, is reading Nazi propaganda. It was an utter mess, a total disaster, a cock-up.
14 Nazis are killed. Hitler is wounded but manages to escape. However, 3 days later he is arrested and charged with treason, being sentenced to 5 years in prison. This looks like the end for the underdog extremist.
As a result of the beer hall putsch, this horrific failure that Hitler kind of tried to lead, he is arrested and he is tried and he is found guilty of trying to, mount a revolution.
Whilst serving his sentence, Hitler grasps at the opportunity to turn his extremist thoughts into literature. During his time of reflection behind bars, Hitler writes Mein Kampf, a book that outlines his ideas for a Nazi political regime. With fellow Nazi Rudolf Hess taking dictation, the book becomes a manifesto for Nazi world order.
Hitler uses this time to take stock and to recharge. And he's in prison with his faithful kind of deputy, Rudolf Hess. And together they draw up basically what's going to be seen as Hitler's manifesto. And it's called Mein Kampf, which in German means my struggle. And this is one of the most extraordinary books ever written.
So what we've got in Mein Kampf is anti-Semitism, very virulent anti-Semitism, really strong language, and this is repeated time and again throughout that book. The other key enemy, of course, was communism or Bolshevism. So in Mein Kampf as well, we have many arguments and this kind of diatribe against this enemy of Bolshevism or communism.
It gives you a lot of insight into Hitler's state of mind. It shows you that Hitler's thinking was kind of all over the place. He would take a theory from there and a theory from there and cobble it together, and 2 and 2 would make 6. It really was intellectually a real mess.
The other thing that he did in Mein Kampf was really to create this, again, this sort of myth or this idea of an Aryan race in Germany, the master race or the Herrenvolk, and the idea that that German race should be unpolluted or untainted by inferior or foreign blood.
Basically, everybody who isn't a purebred, decent German son of the soil or honest factory worker is basically out to get him and the German people.
In Hitler's deranged universe, Jews are at the bottom of the hierarchy, referring to them as a cancer that is eating away at Germany, holding it back from greatness. He wants to eliminate them from the face of the earth. He focuses on this idea of greatness and how Germany should break its agreements to reform itself to become a superior country. He wants to break the Treaty of Versailles. They should be allowed to reclaim their territory that was lost after World War I and rebuild the army to become the most powerful in Europe. He explains his ideas behind Lebensraum, or living space, deciphering that Germany has the right to reclaim the land from racially inferior people and countries.
Lebensraum, living space. Now that's not a living room, that is room in which Germans and Germanic people Hitler feels should be entitled to live in. So it's clear in Mein Kampf that what Hitler wants is a massively expanded Germany. He wants it to be purged of Jews and communists, and he talks about Jews in eliminationist terms. He doesn't actively say, I want to gas them. But what he does say is that he wants to, in some way, get rid of them. So I think, Mein Kampf is this kind of extraordinary document. I really don't recommend reading it, but it's essential that it's still out there so we can see the kind of bedrock of Nazi thinking and how it flourished.
In 1925, after Hitler's early release from prison, he re-establishes the Nazi Party, using Mein Kampf as his manifesto. He enforces this idea that he has been chosen to save Germany, something he intends to do by any means necessary.
After Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in 1925, he set about refounding the Nazi Party, which had fallen into disarray, and really not just refounding it, but really trying to bring it back to strength, and indeed from strength to strength. So between 1925 and 1928, he was very much concerned to try to organize the party as best as possible, put a lot of effort and energy into canvassing, trying to get new membership, and indeed trying to get new voters.
Many people, there's news reports, looking at a little news cutting from the New York Times saying that Hitler is finished because he's gone to prison. We'll never see the likes of him again. How wrong that is. Because Hitler comes out of prison, and by the mid to late 20s, he is starting to build up the Nazi Party as this absolutely kind of awesome apparatus it's going to become.
Wanting to gain mass support from the German people, he wants to reform the appearance of the Nazi Party. focusing on propaganda rather than violence.
Hitler starts to build up his power by, trying to employ and find the right people who are going to listen to the beat of his drum and follow it. And so there's a lot of very patient politicking and a lot of persuasion, a lot of speech making. It's a very, very difficult rise to power. But Hitler knows that it can't take place through force. It has to take place from the ballot box and not the bullet.
Hitler's charisma excites the German people. His enthusiasm and dedication to Germany are exactly what the public are looking for. He encourages them to believe he can drive the country to greatness. He is winning the support of the nation.
Als unbekannter Einzelner diesen Krieg zu beginnen und nicht zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde.
Then, in 1929, a revolutionary event that will propel Hitler's popularity off the scale, practically making him unstoppable: the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash leading to the Great Depression. America suffers and drags Germany down with them. American banks withdraw their loans, leaving the economy in turmoil.
This sort of put into place a really terrible situation for Germany, economically, socially, and politically, because it brought about such a crisis, and none of the governments between 1929 and the time when Hitler came into power in 1933 seemed to be able to deal with the economic crisis, and so it was political and economic turmoil.
6 million people become unemployed, families living in poverty. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are seeing a rise in popularity, with the desperate German people being more impressionable than ever.
Extremist politics thrives on chaos, poverty, destitution, and want. And what you see as a result of the Wall Street crash and the slump, the late 20s, early 30s, are all those things in this hideous cocktail that an extremist like Hitler, and indeed don't forget that communists are also trying to get into power at the same time, and they're seeing this as an opportunity too. So let's not think that Hitler's unique, but obviously he's saying, I can solve this.
Hitler's promises for Germany and its people see a surge in the polls. By September 1930, the Nazi Party is the second largest political party in Germany.
Germany is on her knees. A lot of places are, but Germany's got it really, really badly, because let's not forget, she's still having to pay lots of war reparations to the Allies, such as Britain and France and the United States. And with that, she's got hideous inflation, 6 million people unemployed. A lot of people are literally starving. This is a really, really terrible state for any country to be in. And of course, what Hitler is saying is, I got the solutions.
The fortunes of the Nazi Party really rose in this period between 1929 and 1932. So it managed to increase its percentage of the popular vote, reaching its high point in the summer of 1932 when it achieved more than 37% of the popular vote. And this made it, at that point, the largest party in Germany.
By 1933, the Nazis become the largest party in parliament, and Hitler is offered the chancellorship of a coalition government. With a God complex drilled into his mind, Hitler sees himself as the only leader of Germany. He uses democracy to build popularity, but has every intention of destroying it. With President Hindenburg growing increasingly ill, he persuades Parliament to give him emergency powers, the Enabling Act, and suspend the Constitution.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him, immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events, like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government, and it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left. So the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, for a start, were banned. But over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too. Eventually, in January 1933, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power.
The German people have full support for Hitler, but are clueless to the horrors that are to follow during his reign of terror. Hitler begins by establishing his ideas of an Aryan race, the pure master race of Germans, who are to follow strict reproducing laws, sterilizing people who have hereditary traits he deems unacceptable, that don't match the master race principle.
You have a lot of laws being passed, unsurprisingly, to give the Nazis more power. But also you've got a rise in the apparatus of state terror. You have a thing called the Gestapo, now completely notorious, but that stands for Secret State Police. This is a new police force. There's already the Kripo, the criminal police, but this is a new type of policeman. It's a policeman who is in plain clothes. It's a policeman who recruits informers, on every block, on every street, and every block of flats, in order for the people to effectively police themselves. And of course, this becomes an incredibly important part of the Nazi apparatus.
October 1933. Hitler withdraws Germany from the League of Nations in order to enforce his ideas drawn up in Lebensraum, and with the intent to rebuild the German army. He had the idea of a very aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, and essentially this idea of might over morality, so force over anything rational, I suppose, in a way, force in terms of foreign affairs. And of course, the League of Nations was designed to promote peace and to enhance international relations and security, of course, too. And so this was why Hitler wanted to remove Germany from it. And in addition, this was then going to allow him to start to tear up the Treaty of Versailles in the way that he had hoped and intended all along.
Hitler's being expansionist. He wants more territory. He's looking to Czechoslovakia, to an area called the Sudetenland, where he's identified people who he thinks should rightfully be Germans. And he thinks that those people should be part of the new Nazi Germany. He, of course, is also looking east towards Poland and thinking, maybe I want a bit of that. And he's also, of course, looking down to Austria, which, of course, is a German-speaking country, and thinking, maybe I want to have Austria as part of my new kingdom, if you like. So it's a mixture of slowly absorbing more power into himself, but also then using that power to go out and grab more land.
Shortly after this, he plans to eliminate all other opposition, including those on his own side. He no longer wants to be seen as a violent party and plans to wipe out his own paramilitary organization, the SA, including the head of his stormtroopers, Ernst Röhm.
On the 30th of June 1934, a night that became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler took the opportunity to really get rid of any opposition within the Nazi Party. And really, I think he was looking for an opportunity to really eliminate those who seemed to tarnish somehow the reputation of the party.
What he's very worried about is his relationship with the army. Now, the army and the armed forces generally do not like paramilitary organizations, and specifically the brown shirts, the SA, the stormtroopers. Now, these have been kind of on Hitler's side for a very long time in the run-up to power, but now he's in power. He doesn't need a paramilitary force because he's got this thing called the actual armed forces. You know, he's got a navy, an air force, an army under his direct control. And the generals, they don't like the stormtroopers. They see them as a threat to them. They see them as a rival military force. And they're trying to convince Hitler, look, you've got to get rid of the SA, the stormtroopers.
There was this idea that the stormtroopers, so the SA, led by Ernst Röhm, were somehow overstepping the mark. This idea that they were going to have a second revolution, and this was something that Hitler absolutely did not want. So he wanted the party to be much more respectable and to really get rid of any kind of rough and tumble, let's say, that the stormtroopers still represented.
Becoming known as the Knight of the Long Knives, he uses his SS organization, considered his personal bodyguards, to carry out this task. The SS didn't have much of a reputation at this point, therefore were no threat to the image of the Nazi Party.
You have this absolutely notorious event in 1934 called the Night of the Long Knives, in which Hitler and some of his closest acolytes go around, and with the SS and with certain other people close to him, they go around basically rounding up members of the SA, including Ernst Röhm, who Hitler actually goes down to see in this hotel in southern Germany. And he gets him incarcerated and says, right, you've got to shoot yourself. And Röhm refuses to do it, and eventually he is actually shot. But this is seen as the ultimate sort of expression of Hitler's power, that he can even turn upon his old allies in order to consolidate his own power and in order to get the army directly where he wants it. Where's that? Under his thumb.
This was considered a pivotal moment in Hitler's rise to power. For a man as disturbed as Adolf Hitler, the day to follow was just a normal day. This ordeal really proves to the close followers in the Nazi Party that Hitler is not a force to be reckoned with. In August 1934, President Hindenburg dies, and Hitler unites the chancellorship and presidency into one role for himself, Führer of Germany.
He's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. That is a fascist term, be in no doubt. This is a kind of new form of governance that Germany now has. Other parties are banned. The only party allowed is the Nazi Party. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
With his support from the German people confirmed, Hitler begins to enforce some of his tyrannical policies. In February 1935, Hitler orders Hermann Goering to establish the Luftwaffe, a German air force, which once again defies the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. 1 month later, he rearms the army with the aim of completely undoing the treaty, uniting all the German people who are delighted with his dedication to their nation.
He does everything that the Versailles Treaty tells him not to do. He remilitarizes and marches into various zones where he's not allowed to be, such as the Rhineland. And he also starts building up his armed forces, secretly at first, and then blatantly. All this soon becomes really blatant. And the Allies, such as the British and the French, they just look at it, and what do? They do nothing.
1935 sees the introduction of the Nuremberg Laws. Hitler is beginning to convince the German people that the Jews are to blame for Germany's previous struggles. Marriage between Jews and German people becomes illegal. Jewish people are stripped of their citizenship and all their civil rights.
So we know that from as early as Hitler's writings in Mein Kampf that he was personally anti-Semitic. And what we see once the Third Reich comes into power is his personal anti-Semitism translated into state policy. So from the very earliest days and months of the Third Reich, There were many different measures, legal measures taken against the Jews, and also illegal measures as well.
Just as he had promised in Mein Kampf, Hitler is treating the Jews in Germany as an internal enemy. So what you see are laws stripping Jews of their German citizenship. You see awful things like Jews not being allowed to go to swimming pools, because if a Jew swam in a public swimming pool, the water would have to be drained because the Jew had dirtied the water. So you can see that you've got this sort of awful both political and cultural exclusion of the Jewish community.
And if it wasn't enough to completely demoralize the Jewish population, Hitler takes things one step further. The Night of Broken Glass in 1938 sees the destruction of over 7,000 Jewish shops, and 400 synagogues are burnt to the ground.
When we get to 1938, we come to quite a key moment in the history of Nazi anti-Semitism. We come to the night of the 9th to 10th of November 1938, to a night known as Reichskristallnacht, Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass.
The Nazis just literally set fire to synagogues everywhere, they smash up Jewish shops, and Jews are killed.
Near on 100 people were killed in the course of the night, and between 20 and 30,000 German Jews were taken to concentration camps.
This absolutely horrific destruction, slaughter, violence carried out by the state against its own people. It showed the world what Hitler was. He was effectively a gangster and a murderer.
30,000 Jews are arrested and sent to concentration camps, where they will see out the rest of their lives in torture and unlawful conditions. The German people are unaware of the inhumane treatment that will take place in these camps, but are beginning to realize the severity of Hitler's anti-Semitism.
After the Night of the Broken Glass, the situation for Germany's Jews just got worse and worse from then until the war, and of course during the war as well. They were impoverished, they were made to pay a big atonement fine. Money was taken from them in order to pay for this calamity that they'd allegedly brought upon themselves. There's no doubt about the centrality of anti-Semitism to Hitler's worldview. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But what he seemed to be trying to do was sort of stay in the shadows, so that when we get a pogrom like this, that the public, the German public and the population were quite affronted by it. Maybe not because they particularly supported the Jews, but because it was a sort of flagrant violation of law and order, and sort of a kind of very violent affair across the land. So there wasn't, it wasn't popular in that respect. So there's that idea then that Hitler was sort of staying in the shadows and not being associated with that. I think he managed to maintain his popularity during this time. First of all, because he was staying in the shadows of more unpopular policies. And there was certainly that sentiment among the German population, because of this myth that surrounded the Führer, that, well, if there were unpleasant things going on or policies that they didn't like, all of those sort of more difficult aspects of the Third Reich, then somehow that Hitler couldn't know about it, that he wasn't associated with it, that it had to be one of the other leaders. It can't have been him. If only the Führer knew, this wouldn't be happening.
Alongside this, Hitler is keeping to his promises made in Mein Kampf. Factories are helping to build up the German army to become the most advanced in Europe. This will all support Hitler's plans for Lebensraum, taking back the land he claims they deserve. With each area they take back, Britain and France are still all talk. Nobody is opposing Hitler's army and their storm on attaining land.
More far-sighted people in Britain and France are sort of going, well, where's this going to end? Because if you keep giving someone something, they're going to keep wanting more, because that's human nature, and that's what Hitler did.
However, learning of his plans to invade Poland, the Allied countries make it clear they will declare war. But Hitler ignores their threat, as they've never acted before. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler launches an attack on Poland, underestimating the start of World War II. For the first time, foreign leaders become aware of how insane Hitler really is. Hitler divulges this concept of blitzkrieg, a lightning war, to his German public.
In September 39, Hitler invades Poland, along with Stalin. Soviet Russia also invades Poland at the same time. But what the world remembers is the fact that Hitler invaded Poland, and a couple of days later, the British declare war on Germany. But Hitler's advance through Poland was really quick. It was lightning quick. And actually, the German word blitzkrieg literally means lightning war.
Hitler himself claims it to be a war of racial annihilation. No mercy is to be upheld. Within just 6 weeks, Poland is crushed by the German army and tens of thousands of Poles executed.
The German population, because of Hitler's popularity, and even though they had experienced the horrors of the First World War and the trench warfare of the First World War, and all of the shell shock and everything that went with it, because he was so popular, they might not have been delighted to go to war in September 1939, but they went along with it.
In 1940, Hitler's all-powerful army rules over Denmark, Norway, Holland, and Belgium, and eventually crushes France with their number of tanks. Germany is untouchable.
Really, one of the high points of Hitler's popularity was, the image of the Nazis taking over Paris. So all of these attacks were very sort of quick and easy victories for the Nazis, and they just fed Hitler's success and popularity.
These successes are only fueling Hitler's ego, which leaves him with no hesitation to invade Stalin's Russia, despite their previous peace pact. Hitler enthuses his army with these ideas that nobody is superior to the Aryan race. Therefore, all means of violence and mass murder will be tolerated.
In August 1939, just before the Second World War broke out, an alliance was made between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this seems very strange because we've already said how Hitler hated anything to do with Bolshevism, communism, and indeed the USSR was his ultimate enemy. The idea of eradicating socialism and Bolshevism from the earth was one of Hitler's main priorities. So it seemed a bit anomalous that they would make a pact like that. But of course, he was just trying to pave the way and make the circumstance right for the war and the situation in Poland. So it would be easy, as the attack on Poland was. But then we saw as well how Hitler's very happy to tear up a treaty when it doesn't suit him. So on the 22nd of June, 1941, the Nazis invaded the USSR with Operation Barbarossa.
Stalin's had this pact with Hitler for years, and he's thinking Hitler's never going to invade. Oh dear. Hitler goes straight in, June 1941, and again, the Blitzkrieg, Operation Barbarossa, as it was called in this instance, was tremendously successful. And initially, the forces just went through Russia like a knife through butter, and they slaughtered, pillaged in their wake. This was an absolutely a dazzling piece of offensive warfare.
The army captures Soviet prisoners of war, sending them to starvation camps for their final days, with 2.6 million perishing from hunger. 500,000 others are brutally murdered for quick elimination. Back in Germany, the citizens are under the impression that Germany is all great and all powerful. Hitler's most evil plans are still yet to be realized.
Hitler is always mindful of public opinion. I think that it's always important to remember that Hitler, does always worry about what the German people think about him. He doesn't just sort of seize power in 1933 and then not care. He wants to be liked, he wants to be popular, he is a political leader after all, and all political leaders, democratic or fascist or otherwise, want to be liked. Now, the best way to make yourself liked is to project an image that the people can identify with or respect or admire, and what he does is he uses propaganda and photography and film to show him as this kind of almost sort of messianic figure.
With the German people feeling positive and patriotic, focusing on the war, Hitler can now enforce his most brutal horrors of the Third Reich.
The Nazi regime absolutely hated the Jews and wanted to get rid of them from the very beginning. So we see that with some of the earlier policies, but as we get into the wartime period, of course, the policies become more and more radicalized, more and more extreme. So this idea, essentially the Nazis created this idea of a Jewish question or a Jewish problem that needed a solution. And throughout the course of the Third Reich, they put into place a variety of different measures to try to deal with their so-called Jewish problem.
Hitler's plans for the Jews and when he decided to slaughter them still remain a topic of a lot of historical controversy, because there is no piece of paper that says kill all Jews, signed A. Hitler. But I think that what is absolutely clear is that in conversation, he would have said to his, top leaders, we need to start killing these people. Hitler was smart enough to know this shouldn't be on a piece of paper. The initial idea is that the Jews are rounded up into ghettos and to concentration camps where they can be worked and worked to death. And you see these camps all over occupied Poland and all over Germany itself. Suddenly, around the time of Barbarossa, 41, it starts to get actually eliminationist. And you have what's called Action Reinhardt, in which you got the establishment of 4 actual death camps in what was occupied Poland.
Special death squads are sent in to murder the Jews, the victims being made to dig a trench, then forced to stand inside, waiting to be shot. Groups are continuously sent into the trench to die until it is full of bodies, with a shocking 1.5 million Jews shot in this process. However, the worst is yet to come. In secret, Hitler's inner circle are experimenting with other forms of mass murder to be deemed more efficient. This is known as the final solution.
The Wannsee Conference really was that moment, a kind of very important moment in the evolution of Nazi anti-Semitic policy and in what we call the final solution, because this was the moment that both retrospectively sanctioned what had already been going on, these experiments at the end of 1941, and really set in place then the momentum for the establishment and running of these death camps. And there were 6 of those, all of them on Polish soil through the height of the war.
A secret department, known as T4, is instructed to find a way to kill as many as possible, quickly and quietly, out of the knowledge of the German public.
By the time we get to the end of 1941, the Nazis had already put into place this Action T4, which was actually the extermination of the German asylum population. So Action T4 between 1939 and 1941 had used poisonous gas to kill Germany's mentally and physically ill population. And that was something like 70,000 adults and maybe up to 6,000 children and teenagers.
It really was the most repellent form of kind of Nazi quote-unquote medicine that you could imagine. It is basically chopping people out of life. You're killing them. You're killing children with epilepsy. You're killing people who've got mild spinal deformities. You're killing people who've even got stutters, because you're saying they're genetically weak and we don't want them if we're going to make this strong, blonde, Aryan race full of perfect superhumans.
When the truth about the killing emerges, German people become distressed that their friends and family members may be targeted. They begin to protest and express their dismay towards the horrors they have just uncovered. Hitler quickly withdraws the program, realizing he may have gone too far, realizing the limit of what German people would accept.
And it happened in secret in these kind of horrific hospitals and castles. And these are the sites of some of the worst murders carried out by the Nazis. So it was a repellent program, and the German people knew it when they found out about it. And when it was really appreciated by the public, it was stopped. So it shows you that Hitler was sensitive to public opinion and would go with public opinion when it went against him.
He depicts the future killings needed to be well hidden, and he shouldn't be associated with it. He must fool the German people to portray a kind and caring persona as their Führer, not wanting to lose support from his country. He never personally signs a document for these killings again, keeping his own image in the clear. However, all the other Nazis act in his name, organizing this destruction themselves.
Hitler keeps his public image very clean. People are aware that bad things are happening to Jews and they're being deported, but they're not precisely sure. But you do see glimpses of it, because sometimes you get German parents telling their children, if you don't behave, you'll go up the chimney like Jews. So clearly that suggests there was a sort of kind of knowledge that maybe something like that was going on. But also a lot of German families were more worried about the fate of their own sons, fathers and uncles fighting, especially on the Eastern Front, which is turning into a bloody bloodbath.
Hitler moves the killings from Germany with the idea that they must happen as far away as possible. Building a network of death camps in Poland. This was the beginning of the final solution.
The Germans were involved, in their own experience of the war, preoccupied with their own difficulties. And in a sense, then, once the Jews weren't there anymore, they were sort of out of their frame of reference and just not in their thoughts.
Jews from all over Europe are transported to these camps, unaware of the inhumane scenarios they are about to face. Horror, screams, mass murder. An unimaginable scene of death and destruction. Because of one man's horrific desire for a racially pure nation.
Death camps, all of those were on Polish soil, so they were out of the immediate frame of sight or reference of the Germans. So again, in some way, they were happening elsewhere and not really in their immediate field of vision.
These are places that are places of deep, deep horror, because you didn't go there to work, you went there to die. And you would arrive, and within 30 minutes, you'd be dead. Treblinka, for example, is no bigger, if you visit it, than a football stadium, the size of a football pitch. And in that very small area, around 850,000 men, women and children were gassed. It's just the most horrific thought if you ever visit a place like that. Auschwitz, again, a very huge, iconic place associated with the Holocaust, of course, famously where 1 million Jews were put to death, many of whom were gassed on arrival. But it also was a concentration camp rather than just an extermination camp. So it has these two horrific roles. And don't forget, Auschwitz and places like this, they're huge. Auschwitz is 3 camps spread over about 10 miles. I mean, these are factories of death. There's no doubt about it.
All members of the Nazi Party were required to be a part of the final solution, as it was genocide on a mass scale, therefore needed mass participation. In July of 1944, some resistance is developing within Hitler's own supporters after they're beginning to realize he is full of empty promises. An attempt is made on Hitler's life as a bomb is planted inside a briefcase under the desk in one of his meetings.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler. And of course, today we wish at least just one of them had actually worked.
This was codenamed Operation Valkyrie. So on the 20th of July 1944, Count von Stauffenberg made a serious attempt on the Führer's life by bringing a bomb into the briefing room where Hitler was, placing it under his desk and hoping the intention of Operation Valkyrie was that it would kill Hitler.
They don't want to get rid of Hitler because he's evil. That may be part of it. They want to get rid of Hitler because they think he's fighting the war badly. And they just are fed up with him. And indeed, Hitler is fighting the war badly because he's a terrible, terrible strategist. Bomb goes off and the whole building is basically destroyed. There's no way anybody can survive. But miracle upon miracle, Hitler survives because this oak table is so heavy, so over-engineered, that actually it absorbs so much of the blast that Hitler gets away with, I think, a perforated eardrum, some torn trousers, and a bit of shock.
Hitler survives with minor injuries and becomes increasingly paranoid, leading to a purge of the army to rid it of all possible suspects. After this incident, Hitler becomes increasingly paranoid, developing a tremor and a reliance on prescription medication to cope.
He survives this absolutely huge blast, and people look at the building and think, how can anybody have survived that? He's incredibly lucky, and as a result, of course, the bomb plot fails.
By the end of 1944, 6 million Jews have been murdered upon his approval, due to his own horrific ideals and regime.
We also associate the Holocaust with just people being gassed in gas chambers, but also Jews were slaughtered just by being shot next to vast pits, which would then just be, buried over. This was just the most horrific form of genocide. I mean, gassing, of course, is horrific too. But, the idea that you would just shoot a baby in the head in front of its mother and then shoot the mother, and this would be your day in, day out job. It beggars belief that supposedly ordinary men in these SS police battalions could go around doing this kind of work, but they did. And it was eventually recognized by the Nazis that actually the kind of psychological toll it was having on those carrying out the murders was so great that they had to work out a nicer way to kill Jews, i.e. through maybe lorries with gas going into them, or maybe even gas chambers. So gas chambers are actually invented primarily to spare the sanity of the murderers. That's how twisted Nazi logic becomes.
Hitler is absorbed with the focus on creating a pure race. He is losing the war he created. The inferior nations around him are now closing in on his territory. The war is closing in on Berlin, reducing Hitler and a circle of his closest, most trusted Nazis into a bunker under the ruins of his chancellery. Hitler's image of an all-powerful dictator is slowly decreasing as his tremor gets worse.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory. What it meant was that they were coming closer and closer on their journey westwards to Berlin, and eventually Hitler and a very small inner circle around him had to retreat to his bunker, his underground bunker.
During the last days of his life, Hitler is seen as a demented dictator, battling to rule what had become a phantom Reich, with an army who are no longer listening to his requests. He believed Germany had failed him and no longer deserved his power or ruling. He wanted the whole country to be torn down with him.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death. And he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves, and he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, and he's not there for the world.
One by one, his inner circle began to abandon him as they realize what will happen to them at the end of the war. Only his loyal mistress, Eva Braun, stands beside him, continuing to fuel his demented fantasy that he is still the greatest man in the world. The 30th of April, 1945. Hitler comes to terms with the fact that Germany is losing the war and is beyond repair. He hadn't made a public appearance or speech in months. His victories are long gone, needing a mixture of drugs to keep him sane.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the center of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder of Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
On this day, he finally agrees to marry Eva Braun, just hours before their suicide. The pair tie the knot with what's left of Hitler's loyal advisors as witness.
Finally, after many years of being Hitler's long-term partner, Hitler married Eva Braun that night. It was to be a very short-lived marriage because 2 days later, they both committed suicide together.
He hands her a cyanide capsule, and he holds his pistol. The pair commit suicide together, leaving Germany in ruins. Hitler would rather die than flee Germany and be seen as weak.
Their bodies are burnt in this great kind of almost like a sort of Viking pyre, like a Viking longship going up.
Europe's most evil dictator is dead. Just over a week later, Germany surrenders. As the death camps are uncovered, everyone learns the horrors of the Nazi regime.
On the 7th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. And once that had happened, the atrocities of the Nazi regime came to popular attention.
Ultimately, when it was shown quite how evil Nazism was and the German people fully appreciated it, then yes, the opinion of Hitler was not quite so positive.
The monstrosity that was Nazi Germany will never be forgotten. But modern Germany today has evolved far beyond its past horrors. Hitler instilled some of the world's most evil policies and has gone down in history as the greatest evil to affect Europe.
It was very difficult for the German population to come to terms with what they found out about the Hitler regime after its demise. The Allied occupation from 1945 brought about the demilitarization, the denazification, and the re-education of Germans, and that was very important. But there were also the Nuremberg trials and a host of other post-war trials in which the leading Nazis, at least the ones who hadn't committed suicide, the leading Nazis were brought to trial. Again, this kind of brought to popular attention exactly what the evils of the regime had been for successive generations of Germans. They've really struggled to come to terms with this very difficult aspect of their nation's past.
It's hard to say that there's a specific moment when we know that Germany got over the evil of Hitler's regime. There was no doubt that for many years, decades, a process of learning about your past has taken place in Germany. Of course, school children are taught today in Germany what was done in the name of the German people. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. You can either say the Germans were seized by this bunch of gangsters and then they abused the power that was given to them, or the Germans willingly gave these people this power. Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why you might have voted for Hitler in the 30s, not all of which involved you being evil. But certainly, if you were a fan of Hitler after the war still, and after all the revelations that had come out, then I would say you definitely are evil.
After the true horrors of the Nazi regime were discovered, the world is now more alert to monitoring any rise in extreme right-wing policies, especially regarding racial issues. There is a necessity to uncover any politics that can be regarded as Nazism in disguise, as we have vowed to never let such brutal inhumanity take place again.